Question 1. System analysis indicates that a manufacturing business has experienced significant damage to its primary production machinery due to a covered peril. While the physical damage has been assessed, the insured is experiencing prolonged delays in obtaining replacement parts due to global supply chain disruptions, which are extending the period of business interruption beyond what would typically be expected for such repairs. The insurer is reviewing the business interruption claim. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the principles of fair claims handling and regulatory expectations for this scenario? Option A. The insurer should engage with the insured to understand the specific supply chain challenges, assess the reasonableness of the insured's efforts to mitigate the delay, and consider the impact of these external factors on the indemnity period, potentially extending it if justified. Option B. The insurer should inform the insured that supply chain issues are not covered under the business interruption policy and close the claim based on the initial assessment of physical damage repair timeframes. Option C. The insurer should require the insured to provide extensive documentation proving the global nature of the supply chain disruptions and their direct impact on their specific order before considering any extension of the indemnity period. Option D. The insurer should strictly adhere to the policy's stated indemnity period, regardless of the external supply chain issues, and deny coverage for any loss extending beyond that period. Correct answer is D. The insurer should strictly adhere to the policy's stated indemnity period, regardless of the external supply chain issues, and deny coverage for any loss extending beyond that period. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the insurer must navigate the complexities of a business interruption claim where the insured's ability to quantify their loss is directly impacted by external factors beyond their immediate control, specifically the ongoing supply chain disruptions affecting their ability to resume operations. The insurer's duty of good faith and fair dealing, a cornerstone of claims handling, requires a thorough and equitable investigation, even when faced with such complexities. A failure to adequately consider the insured's efforts to mitigate their loss and the broader economic context could lead to an unfair settlement. Correct approach involves a diligent and empathetic investigation that acknowledges the insured's efforts to resume operations despite external supply chain challenges. This includes working collaboratively with the insured to understand the root causes of the delay, assessing the reasonableness of their mitigation efforts, and considering the impact of these external factors on the indemnity period. This aligns with the principles of fair claims settlement practices, which mandate prompt, fair, and equitable treatment of policyholders. The insurer must act in good faith, meaning they must not deny claims without a valid reason and must conduct a thorough investigation to determine the extent of the loss. This approach respects the policyholder's rights and the insurer's obligations under the policy and relevant regulations. An incorrect approach would be to rigidly apply policy terms without considering the practical realities of the supply chain disruption. For instance, simply stating that the policy only covers a specific period of interruption, without investigating the insured's proactive steps to mitigate the delay or the external forces preventing timely repair or replacement of damaged equipment, would be a failure of good faith. This could be seen as an unreasonable denial or undervaluation of the claim. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the insured's evidence of supply chain issues without independent verification or a reasonable attempt to understand their impact. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and could lead to a breach of the insurer's duty to investigate thoroughly. Furthermore, imposing an overly burdensome documentation requirement on the insured for factors outside their control, without offering reasonable assistance or flexibility, would also be a failure to act in good faith and could be considered an unfair claims practice. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a commitment to understanding the insured's business and the specific circumstances of the loss. This includes actively listening to the insured's concerns, gathering all relevant information, and seeking expert advice if necessary. Insurers should adopt a problem-solving mindset, aiming to find a fair resolution that respects both the policy terms and the insured's legitimate losses. Regular communication with the insured throughout the claims process is crucial to manage expectations and ensure transparency. Question 2. Cost-benefit analysis shows that a strict interpretation of a declaration made by the policyholder, even if it leads to a claim denial and significant cost savings for the insurer, might be technically defensible. However, the policyholder has provided evidence suggesting a reasonable, albeit slightly imprecise, interpretation of the declaration's intent at the time it was made, and the insurer's risk was not materially increased by this imprecision. In this situation, what is the most appropriate course of action for the claims handler? Option A. Seek to renegotiate the terms of the policy retroactively to account for the perceived inaccuracy in the declaration. Option B. Proceed with the claim based on a reasonable interpretation of the declaration, acknowledging that the policyholder's intent and the insurer's risk were not significantly impacted. Option C. Request additional documentation from the policyholder that is not directly relevant to the declaration's accuracy, but might create further delays and discourage the claim. Option D. Deny the claim based on the literal wording of the declaration, prioritizing the insurer's potential cost savings. The correct answer is B. Proceed with the claim based on a reasonable interpretation of the declaration, acknowledging that the policyholder's intent and the insurer's risk were not significantly impacted. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the claims handler to balance the insurer's financial interests with the policyholder's right to a fair and transparent claims process, particularly concerning the interpretation and application of declarations within an insurance policy. The claims handler must exercise careful judgment to ensure that any decision made regarding the validity or scope of a declaration is grounded in policy terms and regulatory requirements, rather than solely on cost-saving motives. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the policy wording, specifically the declaration section, in conjunction with the circumstances of the claim. This approach prioritizes adherence to the policy contract and regulatory obligations. The claims handler must ascertain if the declaration made by the policyholder was accurate, material to the risk accepted by the insurer, and if any breach of that declaration has occurred. If the declaration was accurate and material and no breach has occurred, the claim should proceed based on the policy terms. If a breach is identified, the handler must then assess the impact of that breach on the insurer's liability according to the policy and relevant regulations, ensuring that any denial or limitation of coverage is justified and communicated clearly. This aligns with the principles of fair claims handling, which mandate that policyholders receive the benefits for which they have paid premiums, provided policy conditions are met. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing insurance practices, typically require insurers to act in good faith and to handle claims promptly and fairly, without resorting to technicalities, to avoid legitimate payouts. An incorrect approach would be to interpret the declaration in a manner that unduly favors the insurer's financial interests, even if it means misinterpreting the policy wording or the policyholder's intent. For instance, attempting to void the policy or deny the claim based on a minor or immaterial inaccuracy in a declaration, without proper consideration of its impact on the risk, would be a regulatory and ethical failure. This demonstrates a lack of good faith and could be seen as a breach of the duty to handle claims fairly. Another incorrect approach would be to proceed with a claim denial based on a declaration, without conducting a comprehensive investigation into the facts and the policy terms. This haste to deny, potentially driven by a cost-benefit analysis that prioritizes immediate savings over thoroughness, fails to uphold the insurer's obligation to investigate claims properly and to provide a reasoned decision. Such actions can lead to regulatory sanctions and damage the insurer's reputation. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the policy contract, including all declarations. This should be followed by a factual investigation of the claim circumstances. The handler must then apply the policy terms and relevant regulations to the facts, considering the materiality of any declarations and any potential breaches. Transparency and clear communication with the policyholder throughout this process are paramount. If a decision is made to deny or limit coverage based on a declaration, the justification must be robust, well documented, and communicated in a manner that the policyholder can understand. Question 3. Market research demonstrates that policyholders often express frustration with the claim settlement process, particularly when the distinction between actual cash value (ACV) and replacement cost value (RCV) is not clearly understood or applied. In a scenario where a policy clearly specifies replacement cost value (RCV) coverage for a damaged dwelling, but the claimant is facing immediate financial hardship and expresses a desire for a quicker, albeit lower, settlement, what is the most ethically and regulatorily sound approach for the claims handler? Option A. Settle the claim at the lower actual cash value (ACV) and consider the claim closed as the policyholder expressed a preference for a quicker settlement, implying acceptance of the ACV amount. Option B. Offer an immediate settlement based on actual cash value, ACV, explaining that this is a common practice for expediency, and inform the policyholder that they can pursue the remaining replacement cost value, RCV, difference later if they undertake repairs. Option C. Adhere to the policy's replacement cost value, RCV, provision, explaining the RCV process to the policyholder and facilitating the claim settlement once repairs or replacement are completed, while also offering resources or guidance on managing immediate financial needs. Option D. Delay the settlement process significantly, citing the complexity of RCV calculations to encourage the policyholder to accept a lower actual cash value, ACV, settlement to expedite the resolution. Correct answer is B. Offer an immediate settlement based on actual cash value, ACV, explaining that this is a common practice for expediency, and inform the policyholder that they can pursue the remaining replacement cost value, RCV, difference later if they undertake repairs. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the claims handler to balance the insurer's financial interests with the policyholder's contractual rights and expectations, particularly when the policy language regarding actual cash value, ACV, and replacement cost value, RCV, is subject to interpretation or has been applied inconsistently. The core of the dilemma lies in determining the appropriate payout method when a policy clearly states RCV coverage, but the claimant's immediate need and the insurer's initial assessment lean towards ACV for expediency. Careful judgment is required to ensure fair claims handling, adherence to policy terms, and compliance with regulatory requirements. The correct approach involves adhering strictly to the policy's replacement cost value, RCV, provision. This means the insurer is obligated to pay the cost to repair or replace the damaged property with materials of like kind and quality, without deduction for depreciation, once the repairs or replacement are completed by the policyholder. This approach is ethically sound and regulatorily compliant because it upholds the contractual agreement between the insurer and the insured. Regulations in most jurisdictions, including those typically covered by the AIC 300 exam, mandate that insurers act in good faith and deal fairly with policyholders. Paying RCV as stipulated in the policy fulfills this obligation by providing the insured with the full benefit they purchased, enabling them to restore their property to its pre-loss condition. An incorrect approach would be to offer an ACV settlement based on the initial assessment or the claimant's immediate financial situation, even if the policy clearly states RCV coverage. This is ethically problematic as it deviates from the agreed-upon terms of the insurance contract and potentially deprives the policyholder of the full coverage they paid for. Regulatorily, this could be considered a breach of good faith and fair dealing, potentially leading to regulatory scrutiny and penalties. Another incorrect approach would be to delay the RCV payment indefinitely or impose unreasonable conditions on its disbursement, effectively forcing the policyholder into an ACV settlement. This also violates the principle of fair claims handling and the insurer's obligation to fulfill its contractual promises promptly and without undue burden to the insured. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough review of the policy contract to confirm the coverage type, ACV vs. RCV. If RCV is stipulated, the claims handler must explain the RCV process to the policyholder, including the steps required to receive the full replacement cost. This typically involves the policyholder undertaking the repairs or replacement and then submitting proof of completion and cost to the insurer. The insurer's role is to facilitate this process, provide clear communication, and disperse the funds in accordance with the policy terms and applicable regulations. If there are any ambiguities in the policy language or application, the claims handler should consult with their supervisor or legal counsel to ensure a fair and compliant resolution. Question 4. The risk matrix shows a moderate probability of increased claims costs if policy language is interpreted too broadly, but a high probability of regulatory scrutiny and litigation if interpreted too narrowly to deny a valid claim. A policyholder reports water damage to their basement due to a burst internal pipe that subsequently flooded the basement. The policy defines flood as the rapid inundation of a normally dry area by surface waters. The policy also contains an exclusion for damage caused by or resulting from the backing up of sewers or drains, or the discharge from a sump pump. The claims handler must determine if this loss is covered. Which of the following approaches best aligns with sound claims handling principles and regulatory expectations in this scenario? Option A. Deny the claim, as the policy definition of flood specifically refers to surface waters, and the damage originated from an internal pipe, not external surface water. Option B. Prove the claim immediately, as any water entering the insured property constitutes a covered loss under the policy. Option C. Investigate further by reviewing the specific policy definitions of surface waters, sewers, and drains, and comparing the factual circumstances of the burst pipe and subsequent flooding to these definitions and any relevant exclusions, seeking clarification if policy language remains ambiguous. Option D. Deny the claim based on the exclusion for backing up of sewers or drains, assuming the burst pipe is analogous to a sewer or drain issue. The correct answer is A. Deny the claim, as the policy definition of flood specifically refers to surface waters, and the damage originated from an internal pipe, not external surface water. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the claims handler to interpret ambiguous policy language in the context of a specific factual situation. The insurer has a duty to act in good faith and fair dealing, which includes a thorough and objective investigation and a fair assessment of the claim based on the policy terms. Misinterpreting the policy could lead to an improper denial or underpayment of a valid claim, resulting in a breach of contract and potential regulatory sanctions. The risk matrix highlights the potential for increased claims costs and reputational damage if the policy is applied too broadly, but also the risk of regulatory action and litigation if applied too narrowly to deny a covered loss. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a meticulous review of the policy wording, specifically the definitions of flood and surface water, and comparing these definitions to the documented facts of the loss. This approach prioritizes a thorough understanding of the contractual obligations and the factual circumstances. It aligns with the regulatory framework's emphasis on fair claims handling, which necessitates applying policy terms accurately and without undue delay. This methodical process ensures that the decision is based on the agreed-upon coverage and not on assumptions or external factors. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to immediately deny the claim based on a broad interpretation of flood that excludes damage from a burst pipe, without a detailed examination of the policy's specific definitions and exclusions. This fails to uphold the duty of good faith and fair dealing by not conducting a complete investigation and by potentially misapplying policy terms. It risks violating regulations that mandate fair and prompt claims settlement. Another incorrect approach would be to approve the claim without a thorough investigation into the cause of the water damage, simply because water entered the property. This could lead to paying for a loss that is not covered under the policy, potentially resulting in increased claims costs for the insurer and misrepresentation of coverage to the policyholder. This approach neglects the insurer's responsibility to assess coverage accurately based on policy terms and conditions. A third incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the adjuster's initial assessment without independently verifying the policy language and its applicability. While adjusters provide valuable input, the ultimate responsibility for policy interpretation and coverage determination rests with the claims handler, who must ensure that the decision aligns with the policy contract and regulatory requirements. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such scenarios by first identifying the core coverage question. This involves a detailed review of the policy language, paying close attention to definitions, exclusions, and conditions. Simultaneously, they must gather all relevant facts about the loss, ensuring the investigation is comprehensive and objective. The next step is to meticulously compare the factual findings with the policy provision. If ambiguity exists, the professional should consult internal guidelines, legal counsel, or industry best practices for interpretation, always erring on the side of fairness to the policyholder while adhering to the contract. This structured approach minimizes the risk of improper claim handling and ensures compliance with regulatory and ethical obligations. Question 5. The performance metrics show a significant increase in claims where the claimant alleges injury resulting from a slip and fall incident occurring on the insured's property. The insured maintains they took reasonable precautions to maintain the property. The claimant's representative argues that the insured's failure to immediately address a minor spill, which they claim led to the fall, constitutes negligence. The claims handler must determine if the insured's inaction directly caused the claimant's injuries. Which of the following approaches best demonstrates the correct application of the elements of negligence in this scenario? Option A. Focus solely on the severity of the claimant's injuries and the cost of medical treatment, authorizing payment to avoid further litigation, irrespective of the established causal link to the insured's alleged negligence. Option B. Investigate thoroughly to determine if the insured had a duty of care, if that duty was breached by failing to address the spill in a timely manner, and critically, if this breach was the direct and foreseeable cause of the claimant's fall and subsequent injuries. Option C. Accept the claim and authorize payment based on the claimant's assertion that the spill occurred and they were injured, without further investigation into the foreseeability of the fall or the direct link between the spill and the injury. Option D. Deny the claim because the insured disputes fault and claims they took reasonable precautions, assuming the claimant's injury was not a direct result of the insured's actions. The correct answer is D. Deny the claim because the insured disputes fault and claims they took reasonable precautions, assuming the claimant's injury was not a direct result of the insured's actions. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a claims handler to accurately assess whether a potential claim meets the legal threshold for negligence, specifically focusing on the element of causation. Misinterpreting causation can lead to either an unwarranted denial of a legitimate claim, causing financial hardship and potential legal repercussions for the insured, or an improper payment on a claim that is not legally valid, exposing the insurer to financial loss and potentially impacting future premium calculations. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between a mere sequence of events and a direct, foreseeable link between the insured's actions and the claimant's damages. The correct approach involves a thorough examination of the evidence to establish a direct and foreseeable link between the insured's alleged negligent act or omission and the claimant's injuries or losses. This aligns with the fundamental principles of negligence law, which require proof that the breach of duty by the insured was the proximate cause of the damages suffered by the claimant. In the context of claims handling, this means the insurer must be able to demonstrate that, for the insured's actions, the damages would not have occurred, and that these damages were a reasonably foreseeable consequence of the insured's conduct. Adherence to these principles is crucial for upholding the integrity of the claims process and ensuring fair treatment of all parties involved, as mandated by regulatory frameworks governing insurance practices. An incorrect approach would be to assume causation simply because an event occurred after the insured's action. This fails to establish the necessary legal link and ignores the requirement for foreseeability. Such an assumption could lead to the denial of a valid claim where the damages were caused by an intervening or superseding event, or it could lead to the acceptance of a claim where the insured's actions were merely coincidental and not the actual cause of the loss. Another incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the claimant's damages without adequately investigating the insured's conduct and its direct impact. This overlooks the essential element of breach of duty and its causal connection to the harm. Furthermore, an approach that dismisses a claim solely because the insured disputes fault, without a proper investigation into the elements of negligence, would be a failure to conduct a fair and thorough assessment, potentially violating regulatory requirements for claims handling. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that systematically evaluates each element of negligence: duty, breach, causation, and damages. This involves gathering all relevant evidence, interviewing witnesses, consulting expert opinions if necessary, and applying legal principles to the facts. The focus on causation requires a specific analysis of whether the insured's actions were the direct and foreseeable cause of the claimant's losses. If any element is not sufficiently proven, the claim may not be valid. This structured approach ensures that decisions are based on objective evidence and legal standards, promoting fairness and compliance with regulatory obligations. Question 6. Operational review demonstrates that claimant, dissatisfied with the initial settlement offer for a property damage claim, has become increasingly agitated during a phone call, using accusatory language and demanding a significantly higher payout immediately. The claims handler is feeling pressured to resolve the claim quickly to avoid further escalation. Which of the following negotiation strategies is most appropriate in this situation? Option A. Immediately increase the settlement offer by a substantial amount to appease the claimant and de-escalate the situation. Option B. Respond with a similarly aggressive tone defending the insurer's position and challenging the claimant's accusations directly. Option C. Remain calm, actively listen to the claimant's concerns, acknowledge their frustration, and then calmly reiterate the basis for the current offer, inviting them to provide any additional supporting information. Option D. Inform the claimant that the offer is final and refuse to discuss the matter further, ending the call. The correct answer is A. Immediately increase the settlement offer by a substantial amount to appease the claimant and de-escalate the situation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in claims handling where a claimant, frustrated by perceived delays and a low settlement offer, resorts to aggressive negotiation tactics. The claims handler must balance the need to resolve the claim efficiently with their duty to act fairly and ethically, adhering to regulatory requirements. The challenge lies in de-escalating the situation while maintaining control of the negotiation and ensuring a fair outcome, without succumbing to undue pressure or making concessions that are not justified by the policy or the facts of the loss. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves remaining calm, actively listening to the claimant's concerns, and empathetically acknowledging their frustration, without agreeing with unfounded accusations. The claims handler should then clearly and calmly reiterate the basis for the settlement offer, referencing policy terms and factual findings. They should invite the claimant to provide any additional information or evidence that might support a revised offer, thereby guiding the negotiation back to objective criteria. This approach aligns with the principles of fair claims handling, which require insurers to act with reasonable promptness, investigate thoroughly, and communicate clearly and honestly. It also upholds the ethical obligation to treat all policyholders with respect and to avoid coercive or misleading tactics. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately increase the settlement offer significantly in response to the claimant's aggressive tone. This capitulates to pressure rather than addressing the substance of the claim, can set a precedent for future claims, encouraging similar behavior, and may result in an overpayment that is not supported by the policy or the facts, potentially violating the insurer's duty to its other policyholders and shareholders. It also fails to uphold the principle of fair and equitable settlement based on the merits of the claim. Another incorrect approach is to become defensive and argumentative, mirroring the claimant's aggressive tone. This escalates the conflict, damages the professional relationship, and hinders productive negotiation. It demonstrates a lack of professionalism and can lead to a breakdown in communication, making a fair resolution more difficult. Such behavior could be seen as failing to act with due diligence and good faith, potentially leading to regulatory scrutiny. A third incorrect approach is to disengage from the negotiation by stating that the offer is final and refusing to discuss it further, especially if the claimant is still willing to engage constructively. While the offer may be based on sound reasoning, a complete refusal to discuss can be perceived as unreasonable and may lead to formal complaints or legal action. It fails to demonstrate a commitment to resolving the claim fairly and may violate the duty to communicate effectively and explore all reasonable avenues for settlement. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by first recognizing the emotional component of the claimant's behavior and separating it from the factual and contractual aspects of the claim. The decision-making process should involve active listening to understand the claimant's underlying concerns, even if expressed aggressively. The claims handler should then refer to established internal guidelines, policy provisions, and factual evidence to justify their position. If the claimant presents new information, this should be objectively evaluated. The goal is to steer the conversation towards a resolution based on facts and policy terms, maintaining a professional demeanor throughout. If the claimant remains unreasonable or makes threats, the handler should follow established procedures for escalating the matter or seeking legal advice, always documenting all interactions and decisions. Question 7. The assessment process reveals that a claims handler has received a claim submission that contains some ambiguous statements regarding the cause of loss. The policy wording for this specific peril is also open to interpretation. The claims handler is unsure if the loss is covered under the policy. What is the most appropriate course of action for the claims handler to take? Option A. Accept the claim at face value and proceed with payment without seeking further clarification. Option B. Advise the policyholder that the claim cannot be processed due to the ambiguity and suggest they resubmit when the details are clearer. Option C. Request specific additional information from the policyholder to clarify the ambiguous statements and investigate the interpretation of the policy wording further. Option D. Immediately deny the claim due to the ambiguity in the policy wording and the claimant's statements. The correct answer is D. Immediately deny the claim due to the ambiguity in the policy wording and the claimant's statements. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a common challenge in claims handling, balancing the insurer's need for accurate information with the policyholder's right to a fair and timely claims process. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the claims handler to interpret policy wording, understand the principles of utmost good faith, and adhere to regulatory requirements for fair claims settlement, all while dealing with a potentially ambiguous situation. The claims handler must exercise sound judgment to avoid prejudicing the policyholder's claim, while also ensuring the insurer is not exposed to undue risk due to incomplete or misleading information. The correct approach involves a thorough investigation that is proportionate to the claim's complexity and value, and which respects the policyholder's rights. This includes clearly communicating the need for further information, explaining why it is required, and providing a reasonable timeframe for the policyholder to supply it. This approach aligns with the principle of utmost good faith, which requires both parties to act honestly and fairly. It also adheres to regulatory guidelines that mandate prompt and fair settlement of claims, preventing undue delay or denial based on insufficient investigation or misinterpretation of policy terms. An incorrect approach would be to immediately deny the claim based on the initial lack of information. This fails to uphold the principle of utmost good faith by not giving the policyholder a fair opportunity to provide necessary details. It also risks violating regulatory requirements for fair claims handling, which typically prohibit arbitrary or unsubstantiated claim denials. Another incorrect approach would be to accept the claim without further investigation, despite the identified ambiguity. This could lead to an improper payout and potentially expose the insurer to financial loss, failing the duty to manage risk prudently. Finally, an approach that involves pressuring the policyholder for information without clear justification or a reasonable timeframe would be unethical and likely non-compliant with regulations designed to protect consumers. Professionals should approach such situations by first identifying the core issue, a need for clarification or additional information. They should then consult the policy wording and relevant claims handling guidelines. The next step is to communicate clearly and professionally with the policyholder, explaining the specific information required and the reasons for its necessity, while also setting realistic expectations for the investigation timeline. If the policyholder is unable to provide the information, the handler must then assess the impact of this on the claim's validity based on the available evidence and policy terms, always acting in accordance with regulatory principles of fairness and promptness. Question 8. Compliance review shows that an insurance adjuster handling a commercial auto liability claim has determined that the driver of the insured vehicle, an employee, was involved in an accident while making a delivery. The adjuster is considering whether the employer should be held liable for the damages. Which of the following approaches best reflects the proper application of the respondit superior doctrine in this scenario? Option A. Investigate the employee's actions to determine if they were acting within the scope of their employment duties at the time of the accident, applying the relevant legal tests for vicarious liability. Option B. Assume the employer is fully liable for the accident simply because the employee was driving a company vehicle during a work-related task. Option C. Deny the claim against the employer immediately, as the employee's personal auto insurance should cover any damages. Option D. Focus solely on the employee's personal negligence and disregard any potential employer liability under the doctrine of respondit superior. The correct answer is A. Investigate the employee's actions to determine if they were acting within the scope of their employment duties at the time of the accident, applying the relevant legal tests for vicarious liability. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an adjuster to determine liability for damages caused by an employee acting within the scope of their employment. The principle of respondit superior, a legal doctrine holding employers vicariously liable for the wrongful acts of their employees, is central. The adjuster must navigate the complexities of establishing whether the employee's actions were indeed within the scope of their employment, which can be a nuanced and fact-dependent determination. Misinterpreting this can lead to incorrect claim denials or improper settlements, impacting both the insured and the insurer's financial standing and reputation. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough investigation into the employee's actions and their connection to their job duties. This includes gathering evidence such as witness statements, company policies, training records, and the employee's work schedule and location at the time of the incident. The adjuster must then apply the relevant legal tests for scope of employment, as defined by the applicable jurisdiction's laws. If the evidence demonstrates that the employee was acting in furtherance of the employer's business or performing tasks incidental to their employment, then the employer is likely liable under Respondit Superior. This approach aligns with the principles of fair and equitable claims handling by ensuring that liability is assigned appropriately based on established legal doctrines and factual evidence, thereby upholding the insurer's obligation to process claims according to law and policy. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that immediately denies the claim solely because the individual was an employee without investigating the scope of their employment is incorrect. This fails to acknowledge the doctrine of Respondit Superior and the potential for employer liability. It represents a failure to conduct a proper investigation and may violate regulatory requirements for fair claims handling. Another incorrect approach would be to automatically assume employer liability without sufficient evidence. While Respondit Superior exists, it is not an absolute rule. The employee's actions must be demonstrably linked to their employment. An automatic assumption of liability without due diligence could lead to unwarranted payouts and potentially expose the insurer to subrogation issues or disputes with the employer. This approach bypasses the necessary investigative steps and legal analysis. Finally, an approach that focuses solely on the employee's personal insurance coverage, ignoring the employer's potential vicarious liability, is also flawed. While the employee may have personal liability, the employer's responsibility under Respondit Superior is a separate and often primary consideration in commercial or business-related claims. This oversight neglects a significant avenue of recovery and proper liability determination. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic decision-making framework when faced with Respondit Superior issues. This framework involves 1. Information gathering. Collect all relevant facts and evidence pertaining to the incident and the employee's actions. 2. Legal analysis. Research and understand the specific legal tests for scope of employment in the governing jurisdiction. 3. Application of law to facts. Carefully apply the legal tests to the gathered evidence to determine if the employer is likely liable. 4. Documentation. Maintain detailed records of the investigation, analysis, and decision-making process. 5. Communication. Clearly communicate the findings and rationale to all relevant parties. This structured approach ensures that decisions are based on a thorough understanding of the law and the facts, leading to fair and compliant claim resolutions. Question 9. What factors determine the appropriate application of policy exclusions and limitations when assessing a claim under an insurance policy? Option A. The ease with which the exclusion or limitation can be applied to expedite the claim settlement process. Option B. The precise wording of the exclusion or limitation in the policy document, the specific facts and circumstances of the claim as established through investigation, and any relevant endorsements or riders attached to the policy. Option C. The general understanding of what the policyholder might have expected to be covered, regardless of the explicit policy terms. Option D. The financial impact of the claim on the insurer's reserves and profitability. Correct answer is B. The precise wording of the exclusion or limitation in the policy document, the specific facts and circumstances of the claim as established through investigation, and any relevant endorsements or riders attached to the policy. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a claims handler to navigate the fine line between upholding the terms of an insurance policy, specifically its exclusions and limitations, and acting ethically and in compliance with regulatory requirements. The core challenge lies in interpreting these clauses accurately and applying them fairly to a specific claim, ensuring that the policyholder's reasonable expectations are met while also protecting the insurer from claims that fall outside the scope of coverage. The pressure to settle claims quickly can sometimes conflict with the thoroughness required to identify and correctly apply exclusions. The correct approach involves a meticulous review of the policy wording, including all endorsements, and a thorough investigation of the claim's circumstances to determine if any exclusion or limitation is applicable. This approach is correct because it aligns with the fundamental principles of insurance contracts, which are based on the agreement of the parties as expressed in the policy. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing fair claims handling practices, mandate that insurers act in good faith and deal with policyholders honestly. This includes clearly communicating the terms of the policy, including any exclusions, and applying them consistently and without ambiguity. Ethically, it is imperative to avoid misrepresenting coverage or unfairly denying claims that should be paid. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the insurer's financial interests without a thorough policy review would be ethically and regulatorily flawed. This failure to adequately investigate and interpret the policy terms could lead to an improper denial of a valid claim, violating the duty of good faith and fair dealing owed to the policyholder. Another incorrect approach that broadly applies exclusions without considering specific claim facts or policy nuances would also be problematic. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and could result in the wrongful denial of coverage, contravening regulatory expectations for thorough and fair claims assessment. A third incorrect approach that prioritizes speed of settlement over accurate application of policy terms, potentially overlooking relevant exclusions or limitations, would also be a failure. This haste could lead to paying claims that are not covered or denying claims that are, both of which undermine the integrity of the claims process and violate regulatory mandates for accurate and fair handling. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive understanding of the policy contract, including all exclusions and limitations. This should be followed by a diligent investigation of the facts of the claim. The handler must then objectively compare the claim facts against the policy terms, paying close attention to the precise wording of any potential exclusion or limitation. If ambiguity exists, the handler should seek clarification or guidance, and always err on the side of interpreting the policy in favor of the policyholder when reasonable. Throughout this process, adherence to regulatory guidelines for fair claims handling and ethical principles of honesty and good faith is paramount. Question 10. Examination of the data shows a claims handler is negotiating a settlement for a property damage claim. The policyholder has submitted a claim for extensive damage following a storm. The claims handler has identified a policy exclusion that may apply to a portion of the damage, but has not yet explicitly discussed this exclusion with the policyholder, instead focusing on the undisputed damages to expedite a partial settlement. The claims handler is considering presenting a settlement offer that is significantly lower than the policyholder's initial estimate, intending to leverage the policyholder's perceived urgency to accept a quicker, albeit lower, payout. Which of the following negotiation tactics best aligns with regulatory requirements and ethical principles for claims handling? Option A. Present a settlement offer for the undisputed damages first, and only disclose the potential impact of the exclusion if the policyholder questions the total settlement amount. Option B. Focus on the policyholder's emotional state and urgency to settle, using this to justify a lower settlement offer that is presented as a generous offer for a quick resolution. Option C. Fully disclose the applicable policy exclusion and its potential impact on the claim settlement early in the negotiation process, and engage in good faith discussions based on all relevant policy provisions and evidence. Option D. Emphasize the insurer's right to interpret policy terms strictly, and imply that further negotiation on the disputed portion of the claim will be lengthy and costly for the policyholder. The correct answer is C. Fully disclose the applicable policy exclusion and its potential impact on the claim settlement early in the negotiation process, and engage in good faith discussions based on all relevant policy provisions and evidence. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the claims handler must balance the insurer's financial interests with the policyholder's right to a fair settlement, all while adhering to strict regulatory guidelines. The pressure to settle quickly and efficiently can sometimes lead to tactics that, while seemingly advantageous in the short term, could violate ethical principles and regulatory requirements, potentially leading to disputes, regulatory action, and damage to the insurer's reputation. Careful judgment is required to ensure that negotiation tactics are fair, transparent, and compliant. The correct approach involves a thorough investigation of the claim, a clear understanding of the policy terms and conditions, and a willingness to engage in good faith negotiations based on objective evidence. This approach prioritizes transparency and fairness, ensuring that the settlement offered is reasonable and justifiable. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing claims handling practices, mandate that insurers act in good faith and deal fairly with policyholders. This includes providing clear explanations of coverage, investigating claims promptly and thoroughly, and making reasonable settlement offers. Ethical principles also dictate that negotiations should not involve deception or undue pressure. An incorrect approach that involves withholding crucial information about coverage limitations until late in the negotiation process is ethically problematic and potentially violates regulatory requirements for transparency. Policyholders have a right to understand the full scope of their coverage and any limitations from the outset. Another incorrect approach, such as employing aggressive tactics to pressure the policyholder into accepting a significantly lower settlement than warranted by the evidence, undermines the principle of good faith negotiation. This can be seen as an attempt to exploit the policyholder's vulnerability or lack of expertise. Finally, an approach that focuses solely on minimizing the payout without a genuine assessment of the claim's validity and the policyholder's entitlement, regardless of the evidence, demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to uphold the insurer's obligations. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive understanding of the policy and the facts of the claim. This should be followed by an objective assessment of the claim's value based on evidence and policy terms. Negotiations should then be conducted with transparency, respect, and a commitment to finding a fair resolution that aligns with regulatory and ethical standards. If faced with a situation where a policyholder is being unreasonable, the focus should remain on presenting clear evidence and policy provisions, rather than resorting to manipulative tactics. Question 11. When evaluating a claim where the policy wording regarding coverage for a specific event is unclear and open to multiple interpretations, and the insurer drafted the policy, what is the most appropriate approach to resolve the ambiguity to ensure fair claims handling? Option A. Seek immediate external legal counsel to determine the correct interpretation before making any decision on the claim. Option B. Interpret the ambiguous wording in the manner most favorable to the insurer, as the insurer bears the ultimate financial risk. Option C. Interpret the ambiguous wording against the insurer, as the insurer drafted the policy and is responsible for its clarity. Option D. Ignore the ambiguity and apply a common industry practice for similar claims, assuming that reflects the intended coverage. The correct answer is C. Interpret the ambiguous wording against the insurer, as the insurer drafted the policy and is responsible for its clarity. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the claims handler to navigate the inherent ambiguity in policy language and apply a fundamental principle of insurance contract interpretation. The core difficulty lies in determining the insurer's obligation when the policy wording is unclear, potentially leading to disputes and financial implications for both the policyholder and the insurer. The principle of contra pro frentem is crucial here, as it dictates how such ambiguities should be resolved to ensure fairness and uphold the reasonable expectations of the insured. The correct approach involves interpreting the ambiguous policy wording against the insurer, who drafted the contract. This aligns with the principle of contra pro frentem, which is a well-established rule of contract interpretation in insurance law. This principle ensures that the party that drafted the contract, and thus had the opportunity to make it clear, bears the burden of ambiguity. In the context of insurance, this principle serves to protect the policyholder, who is typically in a weaker bargaining position and relies on the insurer's expertise in drafting clear and understandable terms. Adhering to this principle promotes fairness, upholds the reasonable expectations of the insured, and contributes to the overall integrity of the claims handling process. An incorrect approach would be to interpret the ambiguous wording in favor of the insurer, particularly if this interpretation is more restrictive for the policyholder. This directly violates the principle of contra pro frentem and could be seen as an unfair claims handling practice. It places the burden of the insurer's drafting error on the policyholder, undermining the protective purpose of insurance. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the ambiguity altogether and proceed with a decision based on assumptions or industry norms, without addressing the specific wording of the policy. This fails to engage with the core issue of contractual interpretation and can lead to an arbitrary or unjust outcome. It also neglects the insurer's duty to interpret its own policy provisions diligently. A further incorrect approach would be to seek external legal advice to resolve the ambiguity without first attempting to interpret the policy in accordance with established principles like contra profundum. A legal advice may be necessary in complex cases. The initial step should always be to apply the fundamental rules of contract interpretation to the policy itself. This approach prioritizes external intervention over the internal application of established legal principles, potentially increasing costs and delaying resolution unnecessarily. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. First, identify any potentially ambiguous terms in the policy. Second, attempt to interpret these terms based on the plain meaning of the words, the context of the policy as a whole, and any relevant industry standards. Third, if ambiguity persists, apply the principle of contra profundum, interpreting the wording against the insurer. Fourth, document the rationale for the interpretation clearly. Finally, communicate the decision and its basis to the policyholder in a transparent manner. Question 12. The assessment process reveals that a claimant who has recently experienced a significant property loss due to a fire is understandably distressed and has limited knowledge of insurance policy terms. The adjuster has completed a thorough investigation, confirming coverage for the loss under the policy. The adjuster is now preparing to present a settlement offer. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the principles of fair and ethical claims handling? Option A. Present a settlement offer and refuse to negotiate further, stating that the offer is final and based solely on the adjuster's assessment. Option B. Present a settlement offer and imply that accepting it quickly will prevent further complications or delays in payment. Option C. Present a settlement offer that is fair and reasonable based on the investigation and policy terms, clearly explaining the basis for the offer and inviting further discussion. Option D. Immediately offer a minimal settlement amount to expedite the closure of the claim, given the claimant's apparent distress. The correct answer is C. Present a settlement offer that is fair and reasonable based on the investigation and policy terms, clearly explaining the basis for the offer and inviting further discussion. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in claims handling, balancing the insurer's obligation to settle claims fairly and promptly with the claimant's right to a reasonable settlement. The professional challenge lies in navigating the claimant's emotional state and potential lack of understanding of the claims process, while adhering strictly to the regulatory framework governing claims handling. The adjuster must demonstrate empathy and clear communication without compromising the integrity of the settlement process or violating any regulatory mandates. The correct approach involves a thorough investigation, clear communication of findings and policy terms, and a settlement offer that is fair, reasonable, and supported by the evidence, while also being open to further discussion and negotiation within policy limits. This aligns with the principles of good faith and fair dealing, which are fundamental to insurance regulation. Specifically, regulatory frameworks often mandate that insurers act in good faith, investigate claims diligently, and make fair and reasonable settlement offers. This approach respects the claimant's rights and the insurer's obligations. An incorrect approach of immediately offering a minimal settlement to expedite closure without a full investigation or clear explanation fails to meet the duty of good faith and fair dealing, can be seen as an attempt to take advantage of a potentially vulnerable claimant, and may violate regulations requiring prompt and fair investigation and settlement. Another incorrect approach, that of refusing to negotiate beyond the initial offer without providing a detailed justification, can be perceived as unreasonable and may contravene regulations that encourage or require negotiation to reach a fair settlement. It can also lead to disputes and potential regulatory complaints. Finally, an approach that involves pressuring the claimant to accept a settlement by implying negative consequences for not doing so, such as delaying payment or denying coverage, is unethical and likely violates regulations prohibiting unfair claims settlement practices. Such tactics undermine the trust inherent in the insurer-claimant relationship. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes a comprehensive investigation, transparent communication, and adherence to all applicable regulatory requirements and ethical standards. This involves understanding the policy, gathering all relevant facts, communicating clearly and empathetically with the claimant, and making settlement offers that are both fair and justifiable, while remaining open to reasonable negotiation. Question 13. The control framework reveals that a commercial property policy contains a clause for strict liability coverage related to damage caused by a specific, high-risk industrial process undertaken by the insured. Following an incident where damage occurred, the insured submits a claim. The claims handler, reviewing the initial report, notes that while the damage is evident and directly linked to the insured's industrial process, there is no indication of negligence or failure to follow safety protocols by the insured. What is the most appropriate approach for the claims handler to manage this claim, adhering strictly to the principles of strict liability and the regulatory expectations for claims handling? Option A. Deny the claim because the insured acted responsibly and there is no evidence of fault. Option B. Investigate to determine if the insured was negligent, as negligence is a prerequisite for any insurance payout. Option C. Delay the investigation and request extensive documentation to see if any minor procedural errors can be found to mitigate the payout. Option D. Promptly acknowledge the claim and proceed with a fair assessment of the damages based on the policy's strict liability provisions, assuming no applicable exclusions are present. The correct answer is B. Investigate to determine if the insured was negligent, as negligence is a prerequisite for any insurance payout. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because strict liability, by its nature, shifts the burden of fault away from negligence and towards the mere occurrence of an event or condition. In claims handling, this means an insurer may be liable even if they took reasonable precautions. The challenge lies in accurately assessing the claim under strict liability principles, without overstepping the bounds of the policy or applicable regulations, particularly when the insured may feel unfairly treated due to the absence of fault. Careful judgment is required to balance the insured's expectations with the insurer's contractual and regulatory obligations. The correct approach involves a thorough investigation to confirm that the conditions triggering strict liability under the policy and relevant jurisdiction have indeed been met. This includes verifying the event, the causal link to the insured's activity or property, and the absence of any policy exclusions that might apply even in a strict liability context. The insurer must then process the claim promptly and fairly, adhering to the policy terms and the jurisdiction's claims handling regulations, which typically mandate timely communication, fair settlement, and proper documentation. This approach is ethically sound and regulatorily compliant because it upholds the contractual agreement and respects the principles of good faith and fair dealing inherent in insurance contracts and mandated by regulatory frameworks. An incorrect approach would be to deny the claim solely because the insured was not negligent. This fails to recognize the essence of strict liability, which does not require proof of fault. Such a denial would likely violate regulatory requirements for fair claims handling and could be considered a breach of the duty of good faith. Another incorrect approach would be to offer a settlement that significantly undervalues the loss, even if the strict liability conditions are met. This could occur if the claims handler, accustomed to negligence-based claims, attempts to negotiate down the payout as if fault were a factor. This would be a failure to handle the claim fairly and promptly, potentially contravening regulatory mandates for equitable settlement. A third incorrect approach would be to delay the investigation and decision-making process unnecessarily, perhaps in the hope that the insured will abandon the claim, that further investigation might uncover some form of negligence. Unreasonable delays are a common regulatory violation in claims handling and demonstrate a lack of good faith. Regardless of the liability basis, professionals should approach strict liability claims by first understanding the specific legal basis for strict liability in the relevant jurisdiction and how it is incorporated into the insurance policy. They should then conduct a factual investigation focused on the occurrence and its consequences, rather than the insured's conduct. Communication with the insured should be clear about the process and the basis of liability. Decision-making should be guided by the policy terms, regulatory requirements for promptness and fairness, and the principle of fulfilling the insurer's obligations under strict liability. Question 14. Regulatory review indicates that an adjuster is investigating a property damage claim where the policyholder's account of the incident raises some initial concerns about potential exaggeration. The adjuster has identified several areas requiring further verification, including the extent of the damage and the cause of loss. The policyholder is requesting immediate payment to commence repairs. What is the most appropriate course of action for the adjuster to uphold good faith claims handling principles? Option A. Advise the policyholder that payment will be made only after all repairs are completed and documented, regardless of the investigation's progress. Option B. Inform the policyholder that the claim will be paid in full without further investigation to avoid any perception of bad faith. Option C. Proceed with a thorough and objective investigation into all aspects of the claim, while communicating the need for further information to the policyholder and providing a timeline for the investigation. Option D. Immediately deny the claim due to the initial concerns about exaggeration, advising the policyholder to seek legal counsel. The correct answer is D. Immediately deny the claim due to the initial concerns about exaggeration, advising the policyholder to seek legal counsel. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the adjuster must balance the insurer's need to investigate a potentially fraudulent claim with the policyholder's right to prompt and fair payment. The adjuster's decision-making process is critical in upholding the principle of good faith, which requires insurers to act honestly and fairly in their dealings with policyholders. Failure to do so can lead to regulatory penalties and reputational damage. The correct approach involves conducting a thorough and objective investigation while keeping the policyholder informed and avoiding undue delay. This aligns with the regulatory framework's emphasis on prompt, fair, and equitable claim settlement. Specifically, it reflects the duty to investigate all relevant aspects of a claim without prejudice to the policyholder, and to communicate clearly and timely. The adjuster must gather sufficient information to make an informed decision, but this investigation should not be used as a pretext to avoid payment. An incorrect approach would be to immediately deny the claim based on suspicion alone, without a proper investigation. This violates the duty of good faith by prejudging the claim and failing to provide the policyholder with a fair opportunity to present their case. Another incorrect approach is to excessively delay the investigation, which can be interpreted as an unfair claims practice, as it deprives the policyholder of their rightful benefits. Finally, misrepresenting the policy terms or coverage to the policyholder during the investigation is a clear breach of good faith and ethical conduct. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes objective fact-finding, adherence to policy terms, and clear, consistent communication. This involves 1. Understanding the policy obligations and the claimant's rights. 2. Conducting a prompt and thorough investigation to gather all necessary facts. 3. Evaluating the gathered evidence against the policy terms and applicable regulations. 4. Communicating findings and decisions clearly and promptly to the policyholder. 5. Seeking to resolve the claim fairly and equitably, whether through payment, denial with clear justification, or negotiation. Question 15. The monitoring system demonstrates that a recent property damage claim involves two separate insurance policies issued to the same policyholder for the same property. Policy A contains an excess, other insurance clause, stating it will only pay after the limits of other applicable insurance have been exhausted. Policy B contains a pro rata other insurance clause, stating it will contribute to the loss in proportion to its policy limit. The claims handler must determine how to apply these clauses to settle the claim. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the principles of claims handling and the likely regulatory framework governing other insurance clauses in this jurisdiction? Option A. Advise the policyholder that they must choose which policy to claim under, as the presence of multiple policies creates a conflict that cannot be resolved by the insurer. Option B. Pay the claim in full under Policy A, as it is the first policy identified, and then seek recovery from Policy B. Option C. Determine that Policy B is primary due to its pro rata clause and pay the claim under Policy B, then seek contribution from Policy A. Option D. Ascertain the order of priority based on the specific wording of both other insurance clauses and applicable jurisdictional law, and then apply the appropriate contribution method if concurrent coverage exists. Correct answer is B. Pay the claim in full under Policy A, as it is the first policy identified, and then seek recovery from Policy B. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common but complex challenge in claims handling, determining the order of payment and contribution when multiple insurance policies cover the same loss. The professional challenge lies in accurately interpreting other insurance clauses, which can vary significantly in their wording and intent. Misinterpreting these clauses can lead to incorrect claim payments, disputes between insurers, and potential financial detriment to the policyholder. The core difficulty is applying the specific wording of each policy's other insurance clause to the facts of the loss, and then correctly applying the hierarchy or contribution method dictated by the relevant jurisdiction's laws and the policy terms themselves. This requires a meticulous review of policy documents and a thorough understanding of legal principles governing insurance contracts. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic review of each policy's other insurance clause to determine its type, e.g., excess, pro rata, escape. Following this, the insurer must ascertain the order of priority as dictated by the specific wording of these clauses and any applicable statutory provisions or case law within the specified jurisdiction. If policies are found to be concurrent, e.g., both pro rata, the insurer must then apply the appropriate contribution method, e.g., pro rata by limits, equal division, as stipulated by the policy terms or governing law. This methodical process ensures that the claim is settled in accordance with the contractual obligations of all involved insurers and the rights of the policyholder, adhering to principles of good faith and fair dealing. The regulatory framework for claims handling, such as that governing the Claims Handling Principles and Practices exam, AIC 300, mandates that insurers act with due diligence and fairness, which includes correctly applying policy terms related to other insurance to avoid underpayment or overpayment of claims. Incorrect approaches analysis. An incorrect approach would be to unilaterally decide that one policy is primary and the other is excess without a thorough analysis of both other insurance clauses and relevant legal precedents. This could lead to the primary insurer bearing the full loss when the excess policy should contribute, or vice versa. Another incorrect approach is to assume all other insurance clauses operate identically and apply a default contribution method without examining the specific wording of each policy. This ignores the nuances of contractual interpretation and can result in an inequitable distribution of the loss. Furthermore, ignoring the other insurance clause entirely and paying the full claim without seeking contribution from other potentially liable insurers would be a failure to manage the insurer's financial exposure responsibly and could be seen as a breach of duty to the insurer's stakeholders. Finally, delaying the resolution of the contribution issue to the detriment of the policyholder by not promptly investigating and communicating the findings regarding other insurance would violate principles of timely and fair claims handling. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes thorough policy analysis, legal research, and clear communication. First, identify all potentially applicable insurance policies. Second, meticulously review the other insurance clauses in each policy, categorizing them excess, pro rata, escape. Third, research relevant statutory provisions and case law within the specific jurisdiction that govern the interpretation and application of these clauses. Fourth, determine the order of priority or the method of contribution based on the combined analysis of policy wording and legal authority. Fifth, communicate findings and propose settlement to all involved parties, including the policyholder and other insurers, in a timely and transparent manner. This structured approach ensures compliance with regulatory requirements, upholds ethical obligations, and promotes efficient and fair claims resolution. Question 16. Stakeholder feedback indicates that some claimants feel their personal medical history, unrelated to the specific incident being claimed, is being unnecessarily scrutinized during the claims process. As a claims handler operating under the Claims Handling Principles and Practices exam, AIC 300, regulatory framework, which of the following actions best addresses this concern while adhering to legal and ethical considerations? Option A. Contacting the claimant's employer to inquire about their general health and any reported absences, without specific reference to the claim. Option B. Proceeding with the claim assessment based on the limited information provided, assuming that any undisclosed conditions are not relevant. Option C. Requesting a comprehensive medical history from the claimant's physician, including all past and present conditions, to ensure no pre-existing factors could have influenced the claim. Option D. Informing the claimant that only information directly pertinent to the claimed incident and its consequences will be requested, and clearly explaining why specific pieces of information are necessary for the claim assessment. The correct answer is C. Requesting a comprehensive medical history from the claimant's physician, including all past and present conditions, to ensure no pre-existing factors could have influenced the claim. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the claims handler to balance the insurer's need for accurate information with the claimant's right to privacy and fair treatment, all within the strict confines of regulatory requirements. The claims handler must exercise careful judgment to avoid actions that could be perceived as intrusive, discriminatory, or a breach of confidentiality, while still fulfilling their duty to investigate the claim thoroughly. The correct approach involves a systematic and transparent process of requesting information directly relevant to the claim, clearly explaining the necessity of such information to the claimant, and adhering to data protection principles. This aligns with the regulatory framework's emphasis on fair claims handling, transparency, and the ethical obligation to treat all parties with respect and integrity. Specifically, it upholds the principles of proportionality and necessity in information gathering, ensuring that only what is required to assess the claim is requested, and that the claimant is informed of the purpose. An incorrect approach that involves making assumptions about the claimant's condition based on limited or circumstantial evidence demonstrates a failure to conduct a proper investigation and can lead to unfair claim outcomes. This violates the principle of acting in good faith and can be seen as discriminatory if the assumptions are based on protected characteristics. Another incorrect approach, such as delaying the investigation or payment due to a lack of immediate cooperation without clearly communicating the reasons and the required steps to the claimant, can breach regulatory obligations regarding timely claims handling and communication. This can erode trust and lead to a perception of unfairness. Finally, an incorrect approach that involves sharing claimant information with third parties without explicit consent or a legal basis is a serious breach of privacy and data protection laws, leading to significant legal and ethical repercussions. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Understanding the specific claim details and the information required for assessment. 2. Consulting relevant policy terms and conditions. 3. Identifying applicable regulatory requirements and ethical guidelines. 4. Communicating clearly and transparently with the claimant about the investigation process and information needs. 5. Requesting information in a proportionate and respectful manner, explaining its relevance. 6. Documenting all communications and decisions. 7. Escalating complex or sensitive issues to supervisors or legal counsel when necessary. Question 17. Quality control measures reveal that claims handler, when assessing a property damage claim arising from a severe storm, has focused heavily on the fact that the insured had a pre-existing structural weakness in their roof, which was exacerbated by the storm's high winds. The handler is considering denying the claim based on the pre-existing weakness, even though the storm's winds are clearly a covered peril under the policy. What is the most appropriate course of action for the claims handler to take in determining coverage? Option A. Conduct a thorough investigation to determine if the storm's high winds were the proximate cause of the damage, notwithstanding the pre-existing weakness. Option B. Seek an immediate supervisor's decision without conducting further investigation, as the situation is complex. Option C. Grant the claim in full, as the storm itself is a covered peril, and the pre-existing weakness is irrelevant. Option D. Deny the claim immediately, citing the pre-existing structural weakness as the primary reason for the damage. The correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough investigation to determine if the storm's high winds were the proximate cause of the damage, notwithstanding the pre-existing weakness. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the claims handler to navigate the complex concept of proximate cause in a situation where multiple contributing factors exist, and a decision must be made that significantly impacts the policyholder's coverage. The challenge lies in accurately identifying the dominant or efficient cause of the loss, which is the legal standard for determining coverage under the policy, while also adhering to ethical obligations of fairness and good faith towards the insured. The claims handler must avoid succumbing to pressure or personal bias, and instead apply a rigorous, objective analysis of the facts against the policy terms and relevant legal principles. The correct approach involves a thorough investigation to determine the proximate cause of the loss. This means identifying the event that set in motion a chain of events leading directly to the damage, without being superseded by an independent, intervening cause. The claims handler must meticulously review all evidence, including expert reports, witness statements, and policy language, to establish this causal link. This approach is ethically and regulatorily sound, because it upholds the principle of indemnity by ensuring coverage is provided when the proximate cause of the loss is a covered peril, and it aligns with the duty of good faith and fair dealing owed to the policyholder. Adhering to the policy's terms and conditions, as interpreted by the law of proximate cause, is paramount. An incorrect approach would be to deny the claim solely because a non-covered peril was a contributing factor, without first determining if it was the proximate cause. This fails to acknowledge that covered perils can coexist with non-covered perils, and the law of proximate cause dictates that coverage may still exist if the covered peril was the dominant cause. Such a denial would likely breach the duty of good faith and fair dealing, and could be considered a wrongful denial of a valid claim, violating regulatory principles that require claims to be handled fairly and promptly based on a proper assessment of coverage. Another incorrect approach would be to grant coverage simply because a covered peril was present, without a proper analysis of proximate cause. This could lead to paying for losses that were not intended to be covered by the policy, potentially resulting in financial strain on the insurer and setting a precedent for future claims that deviates from established legal principles. This approach fails to uphold the contractual obligations of the policy and the insurer's responsibility to manage its financial resources prudently. A third incorrect approach would be to rely on an initial, superficial assessment of the situation without conducting a comprehensive investigation into the causal chain. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to properly apply the principles of proximate cause. It risks overlooking critical evidence that could alter the determination of coverage and exposes the insurer to regulatory scrutiny for mishandling the claim. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. First, gather all relevant facts and evidence. Second, understand the policy provisions and applicable legal principles, particularly proximate cause. Third, analyze the evidence in light of these principles to determine the dominant cause of the loss. Fourth, communicate the findings and decision clearly and promptly to the policyholder. And fifth, ensure the decision is documented thoroughly and defensibly. This structured process ensures fairness, accuracy, and compliance with regulatory and ethical standards. Question 18. Research into the impact of different methods for obtaining witness statements on the fairness and accuracy of claims investigations reveals a critical need for best practices. A claims handler is investigating a motor vehicle accident claim. The claimant's passenger, who was present during the incident, has agreed to provide a statement. The claims handler is considering several ways to obtain this statement. Which of the following approaches best upholds the principles of fair claims handling and accurate evidence gathering? Option A. Inform the witness that their statement is not crucial if it appears to contradict the initial police report and proceed without a detailed interview. Option B. Provide the witness with a pre-written statement that aligns with the insurer's initial understanding of the accident and ask them to sign it, explaining that this is a standard procedure. Option C. Interview the witness in a quiet, private location. Ask open-ended questions about their recollection of the event and accurately document their responses, allowing them to review and confirm the written statement. Option D. Ask the witness to relay their account to a colleague of the claimant who is also willing to provide a statement, and then use the colleague's written statement as the primary evidence. The correct answer is C. Interview the witness in a quiet, private location. Ask open-ended questions about their recollection of the event and accurately document their responses, allowing them to review and confirm the written statement. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the claims handler to balance the need for thorough investigation with the ethical and regulatory obligation to obtain witness statements fairly and without undue influence. The potential for a witness to feel pressured or coerced, even unintentionally, necessitates a careful and objective approach. Misinterpreting a witness's statement or failing to document it accurately can lead to disputes, regulatory scrutiny, and ultimately, an unfair claims outcome. The claims handler must demonstrate integrity and adherence to established principles of evidence gathering. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves the claims handler conducting an interview with the witness in a neutral environment, allowing the witness to provide their account freely, and then accurately documenting their statement. This approach is correct because it aligns with the fundamental principles of claims handling, emphasizing fairness, accuracy, and impartiality. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing insurance practices, typically mandate that evidence be gathered objectively. Ethically, This method respects the witness's autonomy and ensures that their statement is a true reflection of their recollection, free from external pressure. The claims handler's role is to facilitate the recording of information, not to shape it. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves the claims handler suggesting specific details or phrasing to the witness to align with the insurer's perceived best interests. This is ethically unacceptable as it constitutes undue influence and potentially leads to a fabricated or biased statement. It violates the principle of obtaining an honest and unvarnished account, which is crucial for a fair claims assessment. Regulatory bodies would view this as a serious breach of conduct, potentially leading to sanctions. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on a statement provided by a third party without direct verification from the witness. While third-party information can be a starting point, it is not a substitute for a direct statement from the witness themselves. This approach risks inaccuracies, hearsay, and a failure to meet the regulatory requirement for due diligence in evidence gathering. It also bypasses the opportunity to clarify ambiguities directly with the witness. A further incorrect approach is to dismiss a witness statement outright if it initially appears to contradict the insurer's initial assessment, without further investigation or clarification. This demonstrates a lack of objectivity and a failure to conduct a thorough investigation. Claims handling principles require that all relevant evidence, even if inconvenient, be considered and properly evaluated. Dismissing evidence prematurely can lead to an unfair outcome and potential regulatory noncompliance. Professional reasoning. Professionals in claims handling must adopt a structured decision-making process when gathering witness statements. This process begins with understanding the objective, to obtain a truthful and accurate account of events relevant to the claim. The claims handler should then plan the interview, considering the witness's comfort and the best environment for them to speak freely. During the interview, active listening and open-ended questions are paramount. The claims handler must remain neutral and avoid leading the witness. Following the interview, the statement must be transcribed or documented with utmost accuracy, and ideally, reviewed with the witness for confirmation. Any discrepancies or areas requiring clarification should be addressed directly and professionally. This methodical approach ensures compliance with regulatory requirements for fair claims handling and upholds ethical standards of integrity and impartiality. Question 19. To address the challenge of preventing future claims arising from a similar incident, which of the following strategies would be most effective and ethically sound for a claims handler to employ after investigating and confirming coverage for the current claim? Option A. Thoroughly investigate the root cause of the current claim, identify contributing factors, and recommend specific, actionable loss prevention measures to the policyholder, while also advising underwriting of any systemic trends. Option B. Implement a significant increase in the policyholder's premium and introduce stringent new policy exclusions to deter future claims, without a detailed analysis of the specific loss cause. Option C. Expedite the settlement of the current claim as quickly as possible, regardless of the underlying causes, to minimize administrative effort and focus on processing new claims. Option D. Delay the resolution of the current claim indefinitely while conducting an exhaustive, broad-ranging study on all potential future risks, unrelated to the specific circumstances of the incident. The correct answer is A. Thoroughly investigate the root cause of the current claim, identify contributing factors, and recommend specific, actionable loss prevention measures to the policyholder, while also advising underwriting of any systemic trends. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a claims handler to balance the immediate need to resolve a claim with the long-term imperative of preventing future, similar claims. This involves proactive risk management, which is not always a primary focus in day-to-day claims processing. Careful judgment is required to identify systemic issues beyond the individual claim and to implement effective preventative measures without unduly delaying the current claim resolution. The correct approach involves a thorough investigation that not only determines coverage and indemnity for the current claim, but also identifies the root cause of the loss. This includes analyzing policy wording, claims history, and external factors that may have contributed to the incident. Based on this analysis, the claims handler should then recommend and implement specific, actionable steps to mitigate future risks. This might involve advising the policyholder on loss prevention techniques, recommending policy endorsements to address emerging risks, or even flagging trends to the underwriting department for broader risk assessment and pricing adjustments. This aligns with the ethical duty of care owed to the policyholder and the insurer's responsibility to manage risk effectively, as often stipulated in claims handling guidelines that emphasize fairness, efficiency, and the prevention of future losses. An incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the immediate settlement of the claim without investigating the underlying causes. This fails to address the potential for recurrence, which could lead to further claims and increased costs for both the policyholder and the insurer. Such an approach neglects the proactive risk management aspect of claims handling, potentially violating principles of good faith and fair dealing by not acting in the best long-term interests of all parties. Another incorrect approach would be to implement overly broad or punitive measures that are not directly linked to the identified root cause of the claim. For example, imposing significant premium increases or restrictive policy conditions without clear evidence that these measures will effectively prevent future losses could be seen as unfair and may not be supported by regulatory guidelines that promote proportionality and reasonableness in risk management. A third incorrect approach would be to delay the settlement of the current claim significantly while pursuing extensive, unrelated risk mitigation strategies. While prevention is important, the primary obligation is to handle the existing claim efficiently and fairly. Unnecessary delays can erode trust and lead to dissatisfaction, potentially resulting in complaints or even regulatory scrutiny. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, thoroughly investigate the current claim to establish facts and coverage. Second, identify the root cause, S, of the loss. Third, assess the potential for future, similar losses. Fourth, develop and implement appropriate risk mitigation strategies that are proportionate and effective. And finally, communicate these findings and actions clearly to the policyholder and relevant internal departments. This ensures that both immediate needs and long-term risk management objectives are met. Question 20. Analysis of a homeowner's insurance claim for water damage to a basement reveals that water entered through a cracked foundation wall following a period of unusually heavy rainfall and saturated ground conditions. The policy contains an exclusion for flood, defined as surface water, waves, tidal water, overflow of a body of water, or spray from any of these, whether or not driven by wind. The policy does not contain any specific endorsements addressing foundation leaks or subterranean water intrusion. Which of the following approaches best applies the policy language to this specific claim scenario? Option A. Interpret the flood exclusion broadly to include any water entering the basement from outside the dwelling, regardless of the specific mechanism of entry. Option B. Offer a partial settlement based on the estimated cost of repairing the foundation crack, without definitively determining coverage for the water damage itself. Option C. Deny the claim based on the flood exclusion, as the water originated from external saturation of the ground, which is a precursor to flooding. Option D. Investigate further to determine if the water intrusion was caused by a plumbing backup or a sump pump failure, as these are typically covered perils, and if not, consider coverage under the general all-risk provisions if the exclusion is not clearly applicable. The correct answer is C. Deny the claim based on the flood exclusion, as the water originated from external saturation of the ground, which is a precursor to flooding. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a claims handler to interpret ambiguous policy language in the context of a specific factual situation, balancing the insurer's contractual obligations with the policyholder's reasonable expectations. Difficulty lies in determining whether the damage falls within the scope of coverage, necessitating a thorough understanding of policy terms, relevant case law, and regulatory expectations for fair claims handling. The correct approach involves a meticulous review of the policy's flood exclusion, considering its precise wording and any applicable endorsements or definitions. This approach prioritizes a fair and accurate application of the policy contract to the facts. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing claims handling practices, mandate that insurers act in good faith and deal fairly with policyholders. This includes investigating claims thoroughly and applying policy terms as written, without seeking to evade responsibility through overly restrictive interpretations. The correct approach aligns with the principle of upholding the insurance contract as intended, providing coverage where it is contractually agreed. An incorrect approach would be to broadly interpret the flood exclusion to encompass any water damage originating from an external source, regardless of the specific cause or circumstances. This would likely violate the duty of good faith and fair dealing, as it could lead to the denial of a claim that was reasonably intended to be covered. Such an interpretation might also contravene regulatory guidelines that prohibit insurers from using ambiguous policy language to deny claims unfairly. Another incorrect approach would be to rely solely on an internal claims manual or a prior similar claims outcome without a fresh, detailed analysis of the current policy wording and facts. This can lead to inconsistent claims handling and may not reflect the current legal or regulatory interpretation of policy terms. It fails to demonstrate the diligent investigation and application of policy language required by law and ethical practice. A further incorrect approach would be to offer a settlement based on a quick, superficial assessment of the damage, without fully investigating the cause and its relation to the policy's coverage and exclusions. This risks underpaying a legitimate claim or denying a claim that should be paid, both of which are detrimental to the policyholder and can result in regulatory scrutiny and penalties. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. A thorough review of the policy contract, paying close attention to definitions, coverage grants, and exclusions. 2. A detailed investigation of the facts surrounding the loss, including the cause and origin of the damage. 3. Consideration of any relevant endorsements or riders that may modify the policy's terms. 4. Research into applicable case law and regulatory guidance that may interpret similar policy language. 5. A balanced assessment of the policy language against the factual findings to determine coverage obligations. 6. Clear and timely communication with the policyholder regarding the coverage decision and the rationale behind it.